What's up, everybody? I'm really excited for our guest today. We have with us economist Gilad Alper. So, for those that don't know, and I presume probably most won't, is I've met Gilad Alper actually on several occasions, including he's even been to my home here in Pardes Chana. But before I say all these glowing things about you, Gilad, I think you can introduce yourself better than I can. So, tell us a little bit what we're here to talk about, and specifically today. And also, I will say one thing about him. He is the founder of the Chofesh, the Freedom Party in Israel. And why don't you tell us a little bit kind of what you're doing with the Freedom Party? And let's start there.
Okay, so just by way of a very short introduction, I'll make it as quick as possible so as to not bore anyone. I studied economics in Israel. I did my second degree in Norway. I worked for many years in Wall Street and in the city of London. I came back to Israel years ago. I work right now in the capital market in Israel, and I'm also heading or running the Israeli Freedom Party, or Mifleget HaChofesh in Hebrew, and it's basically a libertarian party. I mean, it's you can call it classically liberal, but I guess the word liberal is being used by different people in different ways. So just to avoid confusion, I'm using the word libertarian. I think everyone knows what libertarian means. Basically, free economy, um, basic liberties. The state should be as weak and as powerless as possible, and the people should have as many liberties as possible. That's basically the idea in one sentence.
So, why are people opposed to liberty? Because, or do they, or in my, from my perspective, from my experience, is that people aren't opposed to liberty. They just don't know that their values directly counter it.
Right, so that's a very good question. I guess the answer comes down to what we were taught, what you were taught, throughout your life. At least in Israel, for 12 years, people study in government schools. And of course, during those years and after they graduate from schools or from their school, they continue to listen to the mainstream media, or as some people in the US now call it, the corporate media. And during all of those years from the media and from schools, they basically get brainwashed about what liberty is and who protects their liberties. So what they learn, for example, is that the free market is the enemy, rich people are the enemy, everyone exploits everyone in the free market, and it is the role of the state, of the government, to protect the people from the jungle that is the free market. And if it wasn't for the state, then people would go hungry and poor and be exploited by the rich. And oh, thank God for the politicians that protect us. And when people hear that during their entire life, this is what they come to believe. Also, what they sometimes learn in schools and certainly in the media is that their rights are basically not what rights really are. So what they learn is that people have the right for, to be educated, to get health care, to be housed, to be clothed, to be fed. These are the rights. And in the eyes of a libertarian, and certainly in my eyes, rights are not that. Rights are really, your right for life, your right for your property not to be taken or stolen from you, your right not to be harassed, not to be raped, not to be murdered, not to be swindled. These are actual rights. So to kind of give a short answer to your question, the problem is that people were simply taught the wrong things during their lives, so they come now to believe the wrong things, which is why there isn't a single libertarian party in the Israeli parliament. Just people don't vote for libertarian parties.
Would you? Okay, so I mean, there is really good criticism to those that choose not to vote for freedom, in my opinion. And I find that probably one of the most important, the biggest criticisms is that we have bigger priorities than to think about economics and all that. People feel that they have enough ownership over their lives. I have enough freedom. I can walk down the street. I can do what I want, in a sense, except for during Corona. And so people feel like they have their freedoms for the most part. Do you think that people do not know what actual freedom is, or or are people not exposed to just how much control that they have? What is it that makes them say, "Hey, I'm for freedom," And taxpayers in particular would say, yes, I would love less tax. And anyone involved would say, I would love less regulation. And also every employee, not just, employers also, everyone's saying, yes, 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 I want the government out of my life as much as possible, whether you're Haredi or atheist, left or right for the most part, right? Let's say the main people we meet, most people on the street. Why is it never prioritized in Israel?
Well, look, I mean, to start with, people do enjoy some liberties. You do enjoy the liberty to walk down the street, to take most jobs, to open a business, although in Israel, opening a business is an extremely excruciating process. You do have the liberty to leave the country, to immigrate if you don't like it. So Israel does have, or Israelis do enjoy liberties to some extent, certainly more than people enjoy liberties in places like North Korea, or, well, I mean, this is an extreme case, but in some African states and some other states, people enjoy even less liberties there than they do enjoy in Israel. So to an extent, people do enjoy some liberties. But people are not necessarily aware that it is their right to smoke whatever they want, to inject whatever they want, to take whatever job they do want to take, to open businesses in ways that are not limited by the government. And I think people don't necessarily understand what are the rewards of more liberty. People don't understand that Israel as an economy has the potential to be the richest country on the planet. If only we had more liberty, if only we had more free markets, more capitalism, more liberalism. People don't understand what kind of standard of living is being robbed from us by not having the liberties we could have had. So I guess what I'm trying to say in all of my talks when I try to present my ideas of how to improve things in Israel, what I always say is that the reason Israel isn't a much richer country, the reasons are completely technical. There's nothing structural, there's nothing technical that prevents Israel and Israelis from becoming extremely rich. The only thing that we are not there is because of policies that limit our liberties. And if we get rid of those policies, then we're going to become a lot richer. And I guess that once you convince people that this is the situation, that you can become a much richer person living in a much nicer country, then people can maybe slightly become more convinced that maybe this is the right solution for them.
Right. Okay. So I believe that I'm speaking from personal experience, that probably the number one priority for my generation, I'm much a year or two younger than you, for Zionism should absolutely be, I think, the cost of living. The sheer amount of Olim from the West that come here that I'm friends with that go back because how difficult it is, and the sheer amount of Israelis that I work with, and in particular in tech, that I speak so highly of, and that absolutely love Israel, and that just find it hard for them to get a home, and they are like, well, I don't want to. This is just too impossible to make for a living. To make a living here? Would you say probably the greatest challenge within not just economics, not just within freedom, but probably what's facing Israel right now is the cost of living? It is what is being, I think, front and center right now in the new what all the politicians are speaking about.
For sure, I guess the cost of living as it expresses itself in the real estate market and the food market in many other products and services is basically a symptom of Israel not being a free enough economy. We don't allow businesses to open as they wish because the regulation is extremely burdensome. Real estate is extremely expensive because mostly of regulations. Food, we can't import food freely because of regulations, because of limitations on imports. So yeah, I mean, the second you solve the problem of the cost of living, that implies that you basically made the economy, a lot freer. You basically increase the level of capitalism in Israel, and by that you solved many other problems. Now, you mentioned Zionism. I want to emphasize that as far as I'm concerned, a libertarian party is the most Zionistic party in Israel, because the reason that you don't have many more Jews immigrating to Israel is because economically it doesn't make sense, right? If you look at the data of immigration to Israel, almost all of the immigrants are coming from the Soviet, the former USSR. So Russia, Belarus, the Ukraine, and some other countries. And almost all of the Jews that immigrate to Israel come from there. All of these countries are a lot poorer and a lot less capitalistic than Israel. But then if you look at the Jewish communities in the Western, more capitalistic countries like the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, and maybe some other countries, the immigration from there compared to the size of the Jewish communities in those countries is very, very small. And the obvious reason, as far as I'm concerned, is because all of those countries are richer and more capitalistic than Israel. So if you're a Zionist and if your vision of Israel is a country that becomes the number one center of Jews from around the world, and Jews from all over the globe are going to flow into Israel, and 90% of the Jews are going to live here in a free and prosperous country, the only way to make that happen is to make Israel a much more capitalistic country. Because the number one reason for immigration is economics. I mean, people that immigrate out of religious reasons or out of the love of the state of Israel or whatever, well, good for them, but the numbers are rather small. Almost everyone immigrates for economic reasons. So again, if you're a Zionist, if you want more Jews to immigrate to Israel from places like the US or Canada, the only way to make that happen is to make Israel a more capitalistic country. So again, I consider myself a Zionist, and not only that, I consider the solutions I propose as the Freedom Party, the only way to make the Zionist vision come true.
Yeah, so I agree with you. Like I was saying, so I'm one of the few that actually made Aliyah from a wealthy nation. I came from the United States, and I asked myself, like, when people ask, like, "Oh, why would you move here?" Israelis that are born and raised here, right? And I go, well, the first and foremost, the number one reason, Zionists. But then I go, like, there are so many amazing things about living here, despite the challenges, right? So I'll ask any Israeli and anyone listening to this, feel free to address, answer it yourself in your mind, right? If you think of it, take a 10-minute walk from your home, a walk in every direction, how many gan shashuim, meaning parks for kids, are there? And when I try to explain, even though after I got married, I was living in Philadelphia, I was living in the suburbs, very pro-family area, there are no parks in walking distance. You have to drive into a car several minutes. It's a very different thing. Here we have a very great culture that's very family oriented. But at the same time, we have like this polar pulling, I would say, from the left and the right, where the left is pulling us towards socialism, the right towards protectionism, and where they're making deals with each other to get a little bit of what they want, and then the end of the day, the consumer gets screwed. I said, if it was 30 years earlier, when Israel was basically a third world country, I don't think I would have made Aliyah, right? Maybe I would have got a second home. Came in the summer. I'm trying to think how I would, like, because it doesn't. Economics is imperative. At the end of the day, a young person wants to think and build and plan their future, and they're finding that the cost of living as being a big obstacle. First off, if anyone wants to ask any questions, feel free to ask, and I'll pull it up in the chat. Hi, Eitan. So my question for you is, I want to start with what just I read this morning in Globes about the agricultural reforms. Based on what I'm reading, and I keep in mind I'm reading in English, right? It seems like a very positive development, because it seems like what they managed to do, the Israeli farmers didn't want the. I'll give a little background. For those that don't, Israel has very, very, very strong protectionism when it comes to their agriculture. They're reading, they're worried about food security when the anti-Semites of the world will unite against Israel, which I think many people across the spectrum see that as a potential sometime in the future. However, though, in my opinion, I think a lot of our supplies that we get, like fertilizer to feed our cattle and all that, has to be imported anyway. But what we are seeing is that the farmers have been very much having they want to protect their class, just like the taxis everywhere in the world. We were against Uber, very similar thing. But what I've read was that they came to an agreement with the farmers that we're going to allow imports, we're going to lower tariffs, and you're going to have competition. But we're going to remove unnecessary expenses on labor, including, I believe Israelis have to pay like if you bring labor from abroad on a visa to do work, you have to pay for like their pension as if they're an Israeli, and all of these expenses that are worked in. And a lot of these have been rolled back to let Israeli produce be more competitive at home and hopefully more competitive abroad. Do you think there's a positive development here? What do you think about the new law?
The new law is 100% a positive development. It replaces to some extent limitations on imports by direct subsidy or direct payment from the state to to the farmers, to the agriculture industry. What I would say, it's just a first step, and it's extremely complicated. It's not clear if anything actually is going to happen because you actually need to open the market for imports, and then the state pays very large sums directly to the farmers, and it's not exactly clear when and how it's going to be done. Uh, I I don't want to be too skeptical because it is a good first step, but it's only one step. It's kind of small, and I don't think it's really going to solve the problem. Look, in theory, if the state pays the farmers enough money directly, then all of the benefits to the overall population that comes from lower food prices is going to be destroyed by simply having to collect more taxes to pay the direct subsidies to the farmers. So this is probably a little bit an extreme example, but what I'm saying that it's not clear how much imports are going to be permissible because of this new law, and it's not clear how much money is going to be paid directly to the farmers. The way I would do it, probably, I mean, look, in theory, the best solution is to open the market completely to all type of imports, cancel or abolish all of the limitations, and pay nothing to the farmers because the farmers don't deserve more protection than any other sector in Israel. Up until 22, 25 years ago, we had limitations on imports of clothing, on textile, right? Shirts, jeans, shoes, and which is why prices of clothing in Israel was very high and the quality was very low. And then almost overnight, all of the limitations were abolished. Prices dropped like a stone. The level of clothing in Israel, or apparel in Israel now is as high as it is, anywhere else in the world because everything is imported. The industry completely was destroyed because Israel doesn't have any comparative advantage in making apparel, and everyone is just better off. There was a very short-lived spike in unemployment in some places where you had big centers of the textile industry, and that unemployment basically disappeared after less than 1 year. And overall, it was a great step for the overall economy or overall state of Israel. And I think this is exactly what we're supposed to do now with the farmers or with the agriculture industry, which is completely abolish all limitations, all central planning, all interventions, which is, by the way, not only in fruits and vegetables, also the dairy product market and eggs and poultry and meat. Everything is being centrally planned by the state. And all of that should be abolished. But again, going back to the question, yeah, it's a good first positive step.
Right. Yeah. And the telecom said, right, we pay 20%. I think it's even more. I think I pay like 23 to 28% on top of employer taxes, on top of the money that all workers make. And there's no reason
Yeah,
why this should be for
and
foreign
and
workers.
and of course the poor are being penalized the most by those higher prices because the poor spend a higher proportion of their income on food.
On food.
So this is an extremely anti-social policy that is being dressed by some kind of a Zionistic disguise, which is completely false.
Do you think that, like, at one point, maybe it was a legitimate argument for the strengthening of the state when it needed most, and then maybe now it would be a time to transition? Or do you think Israel would have been just as successful if, I know this is hypothetical, right? If she was, let's say, always had, let's say, free market policies, given all the boycotts and everything that there were at Israel's founding by almost the whole world?
I don't think there was any stage in the history of the State of Israel that protectionist policies made sense. Even the
Okay.
first years of existence of the country, we anyway didn't have enough foreign currency to buy anything, almost anything, so they didn't have any. You,
Right.
you didn't need to have any limitations on imports, And anyway, we exported some fruits and
Oranges.
vegetables, especially oranges back then. And that wasn't, a result of a policy. That was just the economy. No, I don't think there was any stage in our history where, um, harming or limiting capitalism or free markets had any sense. Never.
Okay, cool. Okay, so let's talk about actually where things. So we have a positive development. We're going to expect hopefully the prices and the quality of our produce will drop. Just an example, people understand how messed up like protectionism in Israel is, right? If you go, what's the tea company, Wysocki or whatever? I forget their name.
Vysotsky.
Yeah, Vysotsky. Okay, I was saying it right. They lobbied the government that to put tariffs on all tea bags that didn't have staples that stapled the thread to the tea bag. And this is the kind of shenanigans that they put that you and I and everyday people would have no idea. And that's why you can't get good tea or other tea is so expensive. Pineapples is even funnier. They passed the regulation that if you guys ever noticed in Israel, you go and like, why are the pineapples at the store don't have the prickly part on top? And that's because they passed a regulation that any pineapple has to be sold if it's to be imported. Has to cut it off, makes it less attractive, and that tariffs is how they're able to protect themselves here on the local economy. And it's even worse because Israel creates some tremendous produce, but since we have no competition here, what they do is they export all of the good produce where they have to compete, and we keep the shittier produce here.
This is a key point because farmers or the agriculture industry is trying, as I said earlier, to depict themselves as the protectors of Zionism, right? They're the last vestige of the Zionist industry in Israel. They symbolize the connection between the Jews and the land, and we need to protect them. At the same time, they sell all, just like you say, they sell all of the good produce overseas where there's competition and they have to offer good products in order to sell something. And then here, where they have a local monopoly, they give us, the Jews in Israel, all of the lousy products. So if anyone ever has any doubts about the real motivation of the farmers in Israel, there's your proof. They're basically trying to benefit themselves at the expense of everyone else, which is exactly what
Do you
happens
blame
every
them?
time. Of
I'm just
course,
curious. You no,
of
okay.
course.
I was wondering how much because are they talking about their self-interest? I mean, but right, and how much to an it just because it's wrong, right? I think it's wrong. But then again, you know what I mean? Like, do you blame them? Just like I feel
Yeah,
for the old taxi
yeah.
driver doesn't want Uber to come in because it's his livelihood. He doesn't have other skills. And he's good. I can empathize, but I'm just curious, playing a little devil's advocate here.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So look, the blame rests with the politicians, right? The politicians are
That's my
to
point.
blame for everything. Of course, everyone is in their own interest to take care of themselves. And it's the job of the politicians to protect the property rights and the liberties of the citizens, and for instance, allow them to import food and vegetables and fruits and whatever from anywhere they want, and not let their right to import whatever they want to import be limited by some other groups in the citizenry. Now, having said that, when you as a farmer claim to be a Zionist and then you export all of your good products and you sell locally all of your lousy product, then either you're very, very dumb or you're very, very, very hypocritical. So I do blame them for being hypocrites. And of course, as I said, ultimately the politicians are the one to blame.
Okay. What do you think about Mehdi's comment? He's saying agriculture is politically sensitive throughout the world, and therefore there's a lot of protectionism. We saw that with the trade war when Trump was president against China, and then he subsidized kind of similarly, and he added tariffs on China, and then took those tariffs and gave them to the farmers. Would you think this is a global challenge, or do you think this is like uniquely
Oh, sure.
Israel?
No, it's not uniquely Israeli. What is unique for us is that we're doing it so badly, and we're
That we do everything
harming
worse.
we're harming the population to a much larger degree than they do in, let's say, Europe. What they do in Europe is basically they don't have limitations on imports, but the state send checks to the farmers directly, which is what is exactly being tried now in Israel. We're basically emulating what is being done in Europe. If you go to a supermarket in the UK or in Finland or in any of those places, you find pineapples that are about 90% cheaper than the pineapples you find in Israel. So they're basically doing, look, of course, agriculture is a sensitive issue in many countries because farmers in all over the world are trying to basically use the same kind of romanticism that they use in Israel, the connection to the land, the history of the country and whatever. We're just doing it worse than others. We're just harming the population more than others. That's why prices in Israel of fruits and vegetables is about 25% more expensive than in other places, but also the quality is really, really bad. And in many instances, you have shortages. You have shortages of bananas, of butter, some dairy products, avocados, and other stuff.
Let's talk about dairy for a minute. Let me remove Mendy's comment. Let's talk about dairy. There were these cottage cheese protests, they call it, right? Cottage, for those that don't know, cottage cheese was, I think, an Israeli invented cheese, and then Israelis traveling abroad discovering that the same cottage cheese that we export is cheaper abroad. I would like to ask people a question without it. There isn't that I doubt you know the answer. Is how come I can go to America, and I was presume the rest of the world, but I've only lived in the United States other than Israel, and then I can buy cottage cheese that's a small 250-gram container. I can buy one that's as big as this bottle. It's a liter. I can buy cottage cheese of different sizes, and it goes down in price. If you notice in Israel that even if you find bigger packages of cottage cheese, if it's twice the size, 500 grams to the 250, it's literally double the price. Why is it that is it because there isn't is it straight up that we don't have any competition in dairy that's bringing down the prices? We do have more than one company here that creates dairy. Why is it that our prices, even for the cottage cheese that we invented, is more expensive here than when they export it abroad?
Are you asking the audience, or do you expect me to give you an answer?
I expect you to give you an answer. I want them to think and ask
Okay.
themselves, like, dang, like, you ever notice that, like, the containers are small, right? Like, they're playing you, right?
Well,
Like, you
uh,
you
so,
can't buy a
so
liter of cottage cheese and it's 30% less in price because you got a bigger container.
Well, look, the very simple answer is that if you went 50 years ago and traveled to the USSR and you looked at how the dairy market is being managed in the USSR, and then you went back using a time machine to Israel in 2022, the differences would be rather small. The dairy market in Israel is being centrally planned completely. The state basically decides who can produce milk and other products. Um, how, at what prices, who is allowed to sell how much at what prices to whom. Everything is centrally planned at the level that USSR would be proud of. So even if you have, nominally more than one company producing milk, they don't really compete freely with each other. They're basically obeying the orders of the politicians or the representatives of the agriculture lobby nominated by the state.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want prices to drop, the answer, the solution, just in any other parts of the economy, is to stop interfering, stop centrally planning, just let everyone compete with everyone else. There is no, in principle, there's no real difference between the market for milk and the market for cellular phones. If you apply the same principle that you apply today to the cellular market, to the dairy market, I promise you, prices are going to drop and the quality is going to skyrocket, just like in any other instance when you have a free competition.
Can you give, in 2 sentences, explain for those that don't know about how Israel had a cell phone reform, how we went from like the most expensive to like the cheapest in the world for cell phone packages, just so people understand what that looked like and what a shock that was to us. We found out that we were paying like 6x, and overnight it
Sure.
went down.
Yeah, by the way, when I spoke of the cellular market, I spoke about cellular handsets. If you
Ah,
actually, Yeah. If you ask about tariffs, that's a more complicated issue. Up until
Uh,
2011, I guess the prices for using a cell phone in Israel would cost you possibly hundreds of dollars a month, even if you weren't a very heavy user. And then there was a big reform where virtual operators were let into the country, and the established operators were forced to basically give the newcomers the right to use their own networks. It's a complicated question. It's a complicated topic because it's not so clear
okay.
that the outcome was so 100% positive. But that's
Right.
that's a topic for
But I'm
another
not.
conversation.
I think you're a little too wishful. You're looking for 100% positive
Yeah,
from
yeah.
any government, Israel in particular.
Yeah,
All
yeah.
right. Let's.
But look, just think about the market for cellular handsets in Israel, or the market for PCs, or the market for TVs. Just assume we're not allowed to import TVs. Everything is produced locally, and the state decides who can produce TVs, how those TVs are supposed to look like, and what the prices should be like. And just imagine what the TV market is going to look like in Israel. And this is exactly how the food market looks right now in Israel. There's no real difference.
Right. Right. This is just a good comment, and then I want to move on. Mehdi had a great comment that the price flooring is actually creating dead weight in welfare for dairy. Let's move on to drugs. I definitely want to make sure we get the housing and economy and high tech. But yeah, go ahead.
No, just saying dead weight, I guess the guy means that no one actually enjoys it. It's just a lost profit, lost economic benefit. Fun.
Right. Okay. Drugs. So, how many
That's,
Israelis smoke weed? I live in Pardes Chana,
uh,
which is the marijuana capital of Israel. That's what they tell me.
well, yeah, I hear that as well. I think that's something to be proud of, to be honest.
When you came over and when you were running with Zahoot and you were like, I heard on the way here, Toto was coming to Pardes Chana, and you have the highest unvaccinated rate in the country. You were like, can you open the windows, please? I was like, you're hopeless. Anyway, this is before Corona. For those that don't know, this is in the beginning of 2019. Okay, so let's talk about drugs. What's up? What percent of Israeli adults probably have, let's say, are officially criminals?
Well, I would say something like 30%.
Okay, wow, that many. Okay,
30%, yeah. Possibly more, possibly a little bit less, but anyway, it's a huge number.
so I want to address things to a lot of my friends and a lot of people that are saying, like, I don't think people should be arrested, but I understand the value of having drugs not being legal. I'm just talking about, let's say, let's talk about marijuana. Where cocaine and heroin, I would love to go there and talk about that, but I don't want to lose too many people. But they're saying like they're like, yo, I understand, like, I don't want anyone to be locked up. I know there's a lot of people that smoke, they're great people, they shouldn't be criminals. At the same time, I don't want us to encourage and legalize it just like I can go to the store and get a can of Sprite. I don't want that to be the same thing. I think it's a bad example. I hear what they're saying. I would say years ago that was my position. What do you think is the proper response to people that want to have rules and laws and regulations that's friendly and healthy for raising children, and at the same time can allow adults to consume recreational drugs like that they choose, just like they do alcohol, as assuming it doesn't hurt or step on anyone else's liberties?
Let me start from the end. Basically, the solution in my eyes is that cannabis in Israel will be treated exactly like alcohol, which means that any adult above the age of 18 can consume as much as he or she likes. Now, anyone who's worried about people starting using cannabis because all of a sudden it's legal, then you're probably 20 years too late. Everyone who wants to use cannabis right now uses cannabis. It's cheap, it's extremely accessible, extremely available. It's probably easier today to buy cannabis than to buying pineapples, and it's certainly cheaper. So anyone who's worried
True.
about people all of a sudden smoking left and right cannabis, well, again, you're 20 years too late. The only thing that what happens today, because the market is still illegal, the quality is probably not as high as it could be, which only harms people. It makes cannabis look more attractive to younger people because anything that's illegal is attractive when you're 15 years old. So if you want youth to use less cannabis, you probably do want to make it legal, which is, by the way, exactly what happened in Colorado, which is probably the best example of how legalization should work. They did it so successfully that the black market for cannabis in Colorado simply disappeared overnight. And one of the implications is that the usage of youth, or the number of young people, young adults using cannabis actually went down in Colorado, probably because it became less attractive. So anyone who uses, anyone who wants better cannabis, less harmful outcomes, less young people using cannabis, less people being fined and imprisoned, then anyone who wants that should support the full legalization of cannabis in Israel. This is in practical terms. In more theoretical terms, if we go back a little bit to a libertarian type of philosophy, then while I understand why some people find smoking cannabis unattractive, I find the state telling people what to do with their bodies a lot less attractive. Actually, I find it completely an abomination.
Right. It's
The,
pretty
the,
reprehensible.
the
It's important for people to
yeah,
understand. And this, mind if I cut in here, is that like a lot of people don't understand why so many freedom-minded people are obsessed with cannabis, including those that don't consume. But there is something about actually me just chilling at my house and having and if I wanted to smoke a little weed, that I am a criminal, that a cop can come and use that against me to make all kinds of other issues and challenges in my life. And I think people don't understand that it's not about drugs. It's not about wanting to get high. It's about the basic. I have the autonomy over my body, and the fact that the government can know what I'm doing and use that against me and break down my door in front of my kids because I decided to smoke weed on my own in private.
so yeah, firstly, the fact that we don't have an actual autonomy over our own bodies is an abomination, as I said. But I mean, on top of that, just look at the politicians in Israel, people that are usually, by and large, despised by the people. And those people, people like Bibi and Bennett and Gantz and Lapid,
All of them, you mean?
those people, sorry?
All of them, you mean?
All of them, those people that many people find reprehensible, including myself, all of these people have the right to tell, supposedly adult-free people what they can smoke and what they can't smoke. And
Ehud
I
Barak is the
find it
worst.
so,
I think
yeah,
it's
Ehud
important to
Barak is
call.
the
I think
worst.
it's important we call him out because the media won't. He is
Yeah, yeah, so,
probably the
so,
biggest
so, so,
hypocrite. Is
So
evil,
let
evil
me follow
man.
up on
Yeah,
Barak.
sorry.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
yeah. So let
Yeah.
me follow up on Barak a little bit. Because one may ask, how come cannabis isn't legal already? Because there is I think, a fairly widespread public support for legalization of cannabis in Israel. As I said, probably around 1.5 or 2 million people use cannabis anyway. It's extremely prevalent in Israel. It's cheap, pa, 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 pa. So how come it's not legal? And I think the reason it's not legal is because a lot of people, a lot of, let's call them oligarchs, are making a huge amount of money off this market because of medical cannabis. You have a very limited number of companies that have exclusive licenses from the state to produce and sell medical cannabis. And this is basically a money printing machine. And they're printing a lot of money for themselves. And the second you legalize the market, they lose all of their benefits, all of their privileges. And these guys, including Barak, have a lot of political um, power. They are very strong when it comes to lobbying the state for granting privileges. And they're the ones that are fighting the overall population and are convincing, donating to politicians, bribing politicians, offering them lucrative jobs when they retire from politics in exchange for maintaining those privileges. This is what's really happening. And then maybe you can throw into the mix also pharmaceutical companies that are going to suffer from the legalization of cannabis because, as was proven in other places where cannabis was legalized, the consumption of some medications is actually coming down because cannabis replaces opioids and other harmful products.
Right, it's really God's plan. So Ronnie has an excellent comment that I hear a lot of, right? Is that she doesn't want to smell weed. In short, she doesn't want it to be legal. Just like you can see someone drinking a beer, you walk by, it doesn't affect you. But if I walk by someone smoking weed, especially if I'm with my kids, I'm not interested in that smell, right? So what do you? I think that one is that like what I've learned is even where it's legal, you walk around, you're not smelling weed. Like that's number one. Um, right, and by the same argument, you can say why not ban cigarettes? And there are, I believe, restaurants will ban this unless that's their attraction is that we let you bring your own weed. Then they're going to probably overwhelming majority of restaurants are going to be banning marijuana, just like many bakeries aren't selling alcohol, right? What do you think about this argument that my friend Ronnie has?
Look, I mean, currently, the ideal situation, as far as I'm concerned, is that any restaurant or cafe or whatever, if they want to allow people to smoke cigarettes and cannabis, then they should have the right to do that because it's their own property. And obviously, they're going to attract clientele that is interested in smoking cigarettes and cannabis. But then there are many, many people, including myself, that can't stand the smell, certainly of cigarettes, who will prefer to go to restaurants where they won't have to suffer through the stench of cigarettes, and they will have restaurants that cater to their own tastes. I think that's the best solution. If someone doesn't like the stench of cigarettes or cannabis or whatever, then don't go into a restaurant that allows people to smoke cigarettes and
Right.
cannabis. It's,
Mhm.
I think, a very simple solution. To the extent that sometimes in
What
the
about it? What about in
street,
public? What about on the street? What about public? Because you gave a good answer. What about in public? Like I don't want, especially when I'm the kids. Like what's that smell or whatever? Or you know what I mean? So what are your
yeah,
thoughts?
yeah,
And what about in someone's car in public? Like what if I'm in a parking lot and you're smoking in your car with the engine off? That's right.
well, I start from the last part. I don't understand how anyone has any right to tell me what I do in my own car when the windows are, are shut. I mean,
Close. Okay.
I don't even,
Walking in
I don't
public
even,
or
yeah, I don't even understand what's the argument. Walking in public is more complicated, but then you have the same issue today with cigarettes. Cigarettes are a lot stinkier than cannabis. Cannabis
yeah.
has a strong smell, but as far as I'm concerned, at least, it's not abhorrent. Cigarettes are. So, in some places, again, even public spaces, smoking is sometimes, forbidden. In some places, when someone smokes, you ask him politely to not smoke next to you. And if he's nice, he's going to put down the cigarette. And if he's not nice, you're going to distance yourself from him. But the solution to that is not to put people in jail.
Right. Yeah. No, I
So
agree.
what I'm trying to say is that you have a sort of balance in life. You have trade-offs, right? So you don't, some people don't use deodorant and they smell. You don't have a law that
People
puts
have to
people
wear
in jail
deodorant. Right.
because they don't
Especially
use
on the
deodorant.
bus when they're holding their arm up and holding the thing, and they're standing next to you,
Yeah, that's a good reason
and it
never to take a
sucks. But
pass.
well, that's another that's another conversation. All right, let's. Anything else you want to say about drugs? Because I have like a bunch of topics. I'd love to hear your opinion on.
I would only say that I'm surprised people aren't asking about cocaine and heroin. You didn't want to go into that. I will
Well,
say
I find it
only,
interesting, but most people, I find it fascinating because I find it much more intellectual, and people don't think it's relevant. And because I think society looks down on cocaine and heroin a lot more, as they should, and therefore they don't see it, they don't feel it, and they don't see cafes suddenly offering it. And I think they also think that it's not going to be legalized or decriminalized anytime soon. And I would agree with that, probably with that assessment.
um, okay, so basically I guess I was seeing eye to eye on this. I will just say because I want no, I don't want to confuse anyone about my ideology. In principle, there's no distinction between cannabis and heroin. It's your body. I would only say that in Israel, heroin is not an issue because firstly, it doesn't affect the medical market as much as medical cannabis does. And anyway, the chances of
In
heroin being
short, you mean they're not a threat to the pharmaceuticals?
yeah, yeah, and well, I mean,
It's
cannabis
actually an
is a
opportunity.
well, okay, that's another issue. What I'm trying to say that anyway, the chances of heroin being legalized in Israel are a mathematical zero, and it's going to be a mathematical zero for many, many years to come. So there's no point even talking about it. But again, from a principle standpoint, there's no distinction between heroin and cannabis. It's either your body or it's not your body.
Right, but
If
that's
it's
how you're
not your
looking at it. People
body,
don't.
then there's no limit to it. If it is
Right,
your body, then it is your right to destroy it.
right, but you're right, but people. I think what it comes down to is that even if people, let's say, would assume with libertarian and liberal principles, the self-responsibility, and you're responsible for you and your life and your body, and no one else is, people still do not prioritize the responsibility over like the greater. They have other priorities, I think, and unfortunately, I think that falls far behind other things, which is why. And I think that having these, um, even though I agree, by the way, I think all drugs should be legal, and they would be much safer, much better, and everything, including the destructive drugs like heroin and cocaine, if they were to be legal, and it would be much better products. I think people also aren't going. I think that falls on most people's deaf ears, as it's not a priority, and it sounds so far fetched. And anything that they've ever, including me, I have people in my immediate family who've been addicted, and you understand the destruction that doesn't just cause to the person taking the drug, but literally anyone and everyone that crosses that person during addiction.
You would say that the implications of legalizing all drugs in terms of public health are going to, and the public security in terms of crime and stuff like that is going to be hugely positive, hugely positive. But that's maybe a topic for another conversation.
But well, let's do one just of that. I'm sure I could. We can market. I'm sure we get a lot of interested people that would love to challenge you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Let's,
yeah.
let's talk about housing. What the hell is going on?
So you remember I spoke about the food market 10 minutes ago, and I said that if you went to the USSR 50 years ago and then you went back to 2022 Israel and looked at the food market, you wouldn't see a lot of a distinction between the two systems. So the real estate market is right about there. The real estate market, although nominally private in Israel, is extremely, extremely heavily regulated, completely centrally planned and controlled by the government. Most of the land in Israel is owned by the state. The
Like
regulations, as I
93%. How much is it?
well, it's 93%
It's 80 plus
overall the
13.
country, but in Gush Dan, for example, the percentage is much lower. Maybe more than 50%, but it's much lower. The real problem in the center of Israel is regulations and the municipal taxes. Regulations, I mean, in Israel, it's almost impossible to buy a house without bribing someone, during the process. It's just almost impossible.
Why are you laughing,
there's
Gilad?
a,
Did you build a house?
no, 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 no.
Because I
I would
built
never
one.
bribe anyone. I, of course, never break the law. The law is sacred. But what I'm trying to say is that there's a strata of the citizenry in Israel called machers. Macher, which is an old Yiddish word, basically means a mediator, wheeler and dealer, something like that. And you always have machers when you try to do anything in the real estate market in Israel, people that mediate between you and the people that give you permits. And what these machers are usually are basically just people that make the connection and transfer the bribes for you. So the market is heavily regulated, centrally planned, extremely corrupt, and the outcome is that there just aren't enough apartments in Israel. The population grows in
Wait.
Israel.
Hold on. You skipped a lot. Okay, you're saying you're throwing all these accusations, right? I'm not saying they're wrong, right? But now explain, maybe give an example why they're corruption, why are so many people out, where are the regulations, and if we were to remove this, it would take less time to build and it would save less money. If we were to like, what can we do to literally cut the price of, like, I like to see the cut price of housing drop by half. Literally, I think it should be half, 80% probably drop. Did you like what
Ye-
can be specific? Because you're speaking
Okay.
in you're speaking in like generic economic
Well,
terms, and most people this isn't relatable to them, and they're
I'm
not
speaking.
involved in building.
I speak in generalities, but what I'm saying is not. Certainly, it's not something I invented, but it's not even something that is like, everyone knows. It's actually documented and almost proven because you have institutions that make comparison in terms of the regulatory burden between different countries. And the regulations in Israel when it comes to the real estate market are probably by far the worst in the Western world. Within the developed country, we're probably the worst country when it comes to regulations in the real estate market. Now, what does it actually mean? It means that to get a work permit, it takes years, right? To get a permit to start building a house, it takes years. It goes through the municipality and it goes through certain committees and needs to be approved by
I
many
had to go
people
there.
and
Yeah,
many
no, and
bodies.
then they wanted me to make
Yeah.
a change, and then I had to go back to my architect, and then she had to make those changes, and then they're saying maybe put another sewer in case there's too much rain, and then and
And
it's just like
and the list
everything
of
is a
and the
delay.
list of requests is whimsical and it changes and sometimes it contradicts each other the requirements. And for example, just a year ago there was a new requirement that anytime you want to build a new house you need a special engineering company to inspect the quality of the soil itself to make sure it is stable or secure or safe or whatever. For 70 something years, Israel made do without that new regulation, but now apparently we need it. And why do we need it? Because the ability to inspect the quality of the soil, that engineering capability, is one that's being possessed by only a very limited number of big companies. And those big companies lobbied with the politicians and warned them that without inspecting the quality of the soil, houses are going to crumble in Israel, people are going to die, and the politicians are going to be blamed for not instituting this new regulation. This is how things work in Israel in the real estate market in particular, but in many other markets. So my point is that because permits are extremely hard to come by and it takes a lot of time and everything is very time consuming and complicated and expensive and the land is being marketed or sold to real estate developers very slowly. Everything comes down to not enough apartments and flats and buildings and houses being built in Israel, which is why you have an excess demand for housing, which is why prices are going higher. That's all. That's the entire story. And because this is the entire story, the solution to this entire story is basically going to all of those root causes I cited and simply solving them. So the
What
state needs to.
I want to jump in because I want to disagree with you. I think, look, I bought a plot of land and I built on it. I freaking know these headaches, hands on. All right, from the time I purchased to the time I drilled into the core of the earth was like 18 months. No, not even. It's insane, right? Thing that ideally should be done in 60 days for a private home, probably if I move fast enough. But what we have is, however, the cost of land before I went to the regulations, before I went to build, before I went to my architect, before I went to the municipality, before anything was exorbitant. So I feel like the cost of housing is a lot more packed in the land than the building. What do you think?
So, well, look, to an extent, you're right. Of course, land in places like Pardes Chana, at least, is expensive.
Especially now.
But that's not
Yeah.
the issue. I mean,
Right.
that's not the issue in Israel. The issue in Israel, or the main issue, is that Tel Aviv, let's take Tel Aviv for an example. It's the best example, I think, to demonstrate my point. Actually, Gush Dan. Let's take Gush Dan. Gush Dan, to those who don't know, is basically Tel Aviv and the cities that surround it. The metropolitan center of Israel. The metropolitan center of Israel is 25% larger than the entire city of New York. So New York, Manhattan, Queens, Brooklyn, whatever, is 25% smaller in terms of land area than Gush Dan. However, in the state in New York City, you have about 9 or 9.5 million people, million residents. And in the Gush Dan, about a fourth, right? So in theory, you can take the entire population of Israel, put them in Gush Dan, which is smaller than the New York City, and have them live there in the standard of living of New York, which is higher than that of Israel. And in the rest of Israel, you can have summer houses, winter houses, parks, whatever you want to do. So the problem in Israel is that in Gush Dan, which is where everyone wants to live because this is the center of Israel, the commercial and cultural city center of Israel, you simply don't have enough apartments because the density is just very low, which is exactly the opposite of what people say about Israel. They say that Israel is very dense, we have a large population, the country is small, so obviously the price of real estate is high. And that's just not true. New York, as I said, is a lot more dense than Tel Aviv and Gush Dan. Same goes for Barcelona, Paris, and other big cities. In Europe, I think cities are more dense because they're more crowded. In Manhattan, they're more dense, so you have more people living on the same area of land because you have skyscrapers. But whatever, the problem is not about the Schana. The problem is Gush Dan, Tel Aviv. And just to give you, before I let you ask a question, there was an interview in the newspaper with some real estate developer, a big real estate developer in Israel called, I think it's Chaim Katzman. And he said, look, what they're doing now in Tel Aviv is really stupid because they're tearing down old buildings that are 2 or 3 floors high, and they replace them by buildings that are 5 stories high. And this is really dumb. Why is it dumb? Because in 20 years' time, they're going to raise those buildings and replace them with buildings that are 9 stories high because the population grows and the demand for housing is always increasing. So he says, why not build right now skyscrapers in Tel Aviv? 20 stories high and 40 stories high. And if you do that,
I read
you
it's
can.
not as economical. I've read, not about Israel, but in general, because I asked about this years ago to an economist, to build it. He said, it is, put the price of land aside for a minute. He said, it is more economical in many instances to build 2 40-story towers than one 80-story tower. Now, I don't know at what point it becomes, right? And so I don't know what truth there is to that. But it
let's
seems
let's
silly to
let's
me.
go. Let's compromise on 40 on
Right,
40
right. Let's
meters
at
or
least get
40
all the
stories
towers
high
be
in Tel
40.
Aviv.
Right,
Come on. I'll
right.
give you an example. I'll give you an example. In Tel Aviv, in Dizengoff Center, the most desired piece of land in the state of Israel, up until a few years ago, you had the Tel Aviv Cinema. You're fairly a new immigrant to Israel, so you don't know Tel Aviv
9
Cinema,
years,
but it
but yeah,
was
not
yeah
that.
okay. It's an old cinema. It used to be pretty popular, and then it was basically became a failure, and it was basically uninhabited for many years. And now it was raised, and they built a new building instead of the old Tel Aviv cinema. So how many stories do you think they built instead of the Tel Aviv cinema in the most desired piece of land in the state of Israel? 4 stories or 5 stories,
Was
right?
was it
And they
residential,
did it.
commercial?
Yeah, yeah, residential,
Wait, was it the
residential.
person that owned? I mean, the person that owned it would easily been able to get funding for 40, 60-story
I
building,
don't.
right?
Now, why did they do that? As far as I know, because they want to maintain the skyline of Tel Aviv. They want to maintain the character of the city. They want to maintain the old Bauhaus style of some of the new and nice houses, some of the old houses in Tel Aviv. They want to maintain it. And that's fine. I guess it's a legitimate desire, but you need to consider what is the implication. The
Right.
implication is that Tel Aviv is basically a place reserved for the top
Wealthy, wealthy,
for the
wealthy, wealthy.
yeah, the wealthy,
Do
the
you think
top
that's intentional to do that? Do you
100
think it? Do
100%.
you think
I
there's
think
a class thing going on
so.
here? Because I feel that like a little bit in conversations with certain people that seems to defend, let's say, the status quo or the media, is that like they made it or their family were wealthy or they immigrated long enough and bought land and now it's worth millions of dollars, right? That was cost nothing decades ago, and they know they're set and their family's set, and so what do they care? And I have a bigger fear also, is that I'm finding that, and this really scares me the most, is that as there are more and more homeowners, there's now a class of people that are worried about their property value dropping, and they see it as part of their nest egg that their home is going to be worth less, so they won't be able to sell it and, let's say, downgrade, and they'd have a whole bunch of freaking money that they can use, and they use that as a big part of their retirement cushion also. So I'm worried
So,
that there's so many interests that's really screwing over the younger generation, and they're leaving.
sure. So I guess there's a mixture of considerations here. There's just like with the farmers that we mentioned half an hour ago about how them some just pretend to be Zionists and whatever. So also in this case, I guess some people they may pretend to be concerned about the skyline and the old character of the city, and they want to look progressive and advanced and sophisticated. And it's very possible that most of them simply own houses in Israel and they say just, screw everyone else, we just want to maintain our own wealth. However, I do want to address the second point that you made, which is that for homeowners, not investors, the people that actually own houses and live in those houses,
Owner occupied.
if the price of real estate in Israel comes down, that's actually in their interest. It's in their interest because firstly, they have kids and they want their kids to be able to afford houses when they, grow up and leave the nest.
And
And
ideally, by
secondly,
the way, I want to add to that. I want to add to that is that people want, and as a parent, and I have a 10-year-old, even is that, and I'm thinking, she might, she might be married and might make me a grandparent faster than I know. And in a perfect world, it would be nice if she lived next to me, right? Sorry for my parents that I left in America. But if prices are low, therefore it drops significantly, that means they can afford a place near you, let alone ever anywhere, but they don't have to move to the most rural parts of Israel where it's still too expensive in order they can actually live in the neighborhood that they grew up in with the near their friends that they might be, maybe in the synagogue or the community nearby, and most importantly, raise their children near their grandparents.
so one of the happy outcomes of prices dropping is that you have more options and people can afford more stuff. But just to finish my point, not only is that it's the interest of homeowners for prices to fall because they want their kids to be able to afford their own houses, but also don't forget that many people that own houses and live in those houses, their biggest dream is to sell the house and buy a bigger, better house. Now, if the prices of real estate overall in Israel falls down, then their ability to improve only increases because they need to add a smaller amount of money to buy a better place. So the only people that really suffer from the reform I'm suggesting in the real estate market in Israel are investors. And so be it, it's an investment, it's not an insurance policy.
All right, cool. Anything else in housing? If not, I want to move to the current economic situation.
I think that's enough.
Okay, sweet. So people are worried about inflation, recession. I mean, people can read the news. I'm not going to fill anyone in. My first question is, how much is a country like Israel, and I think this goes for many other countries in the world, how much is our economy dependent on the American economy, the Federal Reserve, et cetera? Because I used to think it was a lot, but I think I recall the last recession, I'm not talking about coronavirus, we escaped that economy. I know with the recession, the global recession, and so I used to think that if America struggles, there's less money, there'll be less foreign direct investment. Startups and tech companies, which is the driving growth behind Israel's economy, will slow down, growth will stop. But it didn't seem like last time. But now we're seeing a lot of layoffs and things seem to be different. Before we get into like right now, in general, how much of an effect does American policy have on the Israeli economy? Or for that matter, let's say even China or other large economies?
I think the impact is critical. Israel, especially Israel, is a small open economy, and our by far the most thriving part of the economy is the technology, of course. I mean, the entire for I don't know who's exactly watching this talk, but that's for anyone who doesn't know. The
No one that
only
agrees with
part
us, Gilad, I promise.
The only part of the Israeli economy that actually functions really, really well is the tech
Tech,
sector. I
because
mean,
it's not
this is the
regulated.
foundation.
Because it's
This is, yeah,
underregulated
no,
in,
it's
in
it's
America.
unregulated. It's open to competition, whatever. All of the good things, all of the good stuff. But this is really the foundation of the economy in Israel. Anyway, my point is that if the U.S. actually goes into a very deep recession, which means that investments in the tech industry are going to plummet, then for sure it's going to have a very detrimental, significantly detrimental impact on the economy of Israel. But now, I mean, the story does become a lot more complicated. If you look, for example, at the 2008 crisis, or the recession in the U.S., the recession was very short-lived. It was very deep, but it was very short-lived, and it was very short-lived because the Fed, the American Central Bank, started to print money like there was no tomorrow. They started to print money on levels that were unprecedented, which is
At
why
that
the
point,
recession.
unprecedented
Yeah,
2008.
exactly. I said unprecedented, and then I thought, well, compared to today, what they did then was very
Was a joke.
conservative.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's why the recession was very short-lived. Now it could be different because if the recession hits strongly, the the problem now is that you also have inflation. So it's going to be a lot tougher for the Fed to get out of this recession the way they got out of the recent recessions, also the one in the years 2000, 2001, because if you print more money when you're already in a monetary inflation, then the problem only becomes worse, and that's a problematic situation. So I'm not sure what's going to happen right now. I would just say that in principle, Israel is a small open economy, heavily dependent on investments from the US in the tech sector. And if the US goes into a very deep recession, then we are in a recession as well.
Okay, got it. Cool. And where do you think we are? So, is there anything Israel can do to mitigate or navigate the fact that to the recession, since it's coming from America, or are we basically hopeless?
No, 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 no. I mean, look, if Israel was now a purely capitalistic country, if we were as capitalistic as Switzerland
Singapore,
or Hong Kong of 2 years
formerly,
ago, yeah, formerly
formerly.
what used to be a free country over there, or a semi-free country, then I'd say that the way Israel can respond to the upcoming recession is maybe somewhat limited because there's just so much you can do. As it stands right now, Israel is one of the least capitalistic country in the developed world. We are approximate number 40 or 35, depending on how we look. But anyway, we're one of the least capitalistic countries in the developed world,
OECD.
which means in the OECD, which means that the way for us right now to get out of the recession, or to try to at least make sure that the impact isn't going to be as negative as it could be, is to free the economy, deregulate, open the country to free trade, to free imports, finally control wages in the public sector, finally go into the voucher system in the education system as to stop the ever increasing expenditure in the education sector, which doesn't do anything to the level of education, just basically turn Israel into a free economy. And then not only the impact of the recession is going to be that much lighter. When you get out of the recession, Israel can grow so much faster than anyone else. And so in theory, if we do become a capitalistic country with a human capital that we do have in Israel, with the appetite for risk and the entrepreneurial spirit we have in Israel, we can very quickly, within 10 or 20 years, become the richest country on the face of this planet. It's very simple. Not only that it is simple, it is, it's going to succeed for sure. And you know that it's going to succeed for sure because you have many other countries in the world that have had many other system and economic, regimes over the last, I don't know, 100 years. And what you can see is that always when you have a country that becomes more capitalistic, it becomes richer, and also the vice versa, right? So I think this is the solution right now. You want to avoid the worst outcome of the recession, free the economy.
Got it. Okay. So but it's all right. Well, so that's not going to happen in the short term. So therefore, we're stuck with the decisions of the American federal government and the Federal Reserve.
Yeah, look, just to kind of reiterate the point without being too boring, the good thing about all of our economic troubles is that they're all very easily solvable. It's all technical.
I know
You, you,
that's why it's so damn frustrating.
well, I mean, if you
It's not like
compare
we're
that
in
to
Russia and like we can't solve it with Putin. It doesn't work in China. It's solvable. We can so
you
easily be
know,
rich.
because Israel has two big issues, right? The first one is the economy, and the second one is, geopolitics. Geopolitics, I have no idea how to solve it, although I can tell you that probably no one else has any idea how to solve it. Our economic problems, solvable, technical, easy to understand, easy to identify, easy to solve. The problem is political.
Okay, cool. Let's talk about education, which is probably one of my favorite topics.
Okay.
Um, so, because I haven't stated it already, I live in Pardes Khana. We have a lot of amazing educational opportunities here, probably more than much of the rest of the country. Our mutual friend, Libi
Mhm.
Malad, she also came and spoke about education in my home back in early 2019. Um, and it's kind of funny to me how I made a post on LinkedIn about the teachers union a couple days last week. I was supposed to go to Cyber Week with some of my team members, and because the teachers decided to, because they hate your kids and they hate you as parents, they're like, we're just going to continue to strike. And now my team couldn't go to Cyber Week. It hurt the economy. It hurt the Parnassah. It hurt our growth because they had to stay home with their young children. This is a problem, and of course I posted it. I got some agreement. A lot of people agree with me privately in message, and of course some people don't misread everything I write. They missed out. But is it possible? Currently, we are having a situation in Israel, which I think is pretty. It's also, I think, a challenge in America and other Western countries, where for some reason the even the politicians don't choose the education and the parents don't choose the education. The fact that I don't choose if my kid goes to school tomorrow, but a teachers union does, and what they learn and who their teacher is I have no control over this if I go to an Israeli public institution. And then we complain about the shitty education. Why is it that people can't connect, well, people can't connect the dots?
I think that once, this is going back to what we said in the beginning of this conversation. Once you spend your, 12 years from the age of 6 to the age of 18 in schools, in government schools, and everything you study during those years is that the rich are evil, and
Are they
the
really
trade
teaching that? I
unions.
didn't go to school here, and they taught me that university in
Oh, yeah, yeah,
America.
yeah.
But I was just more like it was really gross. But in what do you mean, like middle school? There, what are they saying? What do you mean? Can you
Yeah.
expound?
So,
Yeah, because I
so
believe people
basic.
don't even know what their kids are learning. I think some parents would be shocked.
Yeah, I think that recently there's more and more talk about stuff that has to do with more progressive values and, and the transgender stuff and what have you. But certainly during the last decades, since the beginning of the country, as far as I know, what you're being taught in school is that the free market is the enemy, and people have a right to have high wages and education and housing and everything else. And competition is bad, and regulation is good. And if you let the free market roam free, then the poor are going to be exploited, all of those things. So one of the implications of that is that you don't want the free market to educate your kids. You want to make sure that the trade unions have special privileges because otherwise you're going to have exploitation and whatever. And all of these things that people learn for 12 years and then they hear it also from the media for their entire lives is the outcome is basically that freedom is bad, supervision from the state is good, and therefore you need to have the state to make sure that your kids learn, whatever they need to learn in schools. And if you let, private business people educate your kids, then your kids are going to become small cogs in some horrible capitalistic machine and they're going to be exploited. I think that's what is resting in the foundation of this ideology in Israel that is fighting against free education or the voucher system, right? Free competition between schools and whatever.
People
I'm
don't know
not
what
even
that is.
talking about,
Gilad, you're
yeah, yeah.
mumble. You're saying you have to break down. You have to explain to people what the voucher system is, because I think many.
Okay,
I think
so
it's a
basically,
foreign. I talk to people, Israelis even. It's a totally foreign concept to them. So maybe
yeah.
you can explain to them an alternative view, even if they might disagree.
Yeah, yeah. So remember when I said half an hour ago that if you go to the USSR 50 years ago and then you go back to Israel 2022 and you find the food market is fairly similar. So if I want to maybe cite one system, one market, one industry in Israel that is the most similar to the USSR or North Korea, then it's the education system. It's a complete government monopoly where the government decides on the schools, pays everyone's salaries, decides who goes to school, who teaches the kids, what they teach kids, what hours, what methods, everything to the level of the of I don't know, everything is being determined by the Ministry of Education. A bunch of regulators, public sector employees, and politicians. They decide on everything. And of course, all of the schools are monopolies, right? Because you have to send your kids to school, otherwise you're basically breaking the law. And you have very, very few private schools in Israel. For 98%, I guess, of the population, you basically are forced to send your kids to government schools, to the government monopolies, and they get whatever education they get there. And the education level in Israel is low, at least based on international comparisons. The level of satisfaction from parents of the education system is low. Everyone knows the system doesn't work. But because everyone or many people are also averse to free market solutions, the voucher system still hasn't been implemented in Israel. What is the voucher system? It's basically a way to combine public funding with private schooling and private competition. So you have schools that are owned by, I don't know, NGOs,
Entrepreneurs,
entrepreneurs,
people. That's right.
business people, whatever. And those schools have to convince parents to send their kids to those schools. And let's talk in a second how they convince them. And the government pays the schools per the number of kids that they manage to convince to come to the school. So the only way for the school to generate income is to convince parents to send kids to those schools. And you have many private schools and they all have to compete with each other. And let me give you some kind of an example that I
In
hope
in
will
in, in short, in short, I just want to maybe so people that don't understand, because I think you're so involved in this that you forget that we speak on a level that many people that might
maybe
not be exposed a little too high.
I'm skipping levels maybe in the
Right. So
explanation. Yeah.
let me break it down for regular folk. Uh, Currently, you're paying taxes. They take your taxes and then they give it to the teachers' unions. They decide what to do, if and how to educate or miseducate your children. Instead, imagine that just like you get to choose where you go for your Kupat Halim, for your medical, you could go to Maccabi, Kali. You can go and you can choose, where do I want to send my kid? And there will be unlimited and amazing options, and they have to compete where you send your student. If you send your student there, let's say there's, I'm making up numbers, 5,000 shekels a month the school gets. They put that towards the teachers, towards the school. If it's private, if it's an NGO, they can give you such a good experience, bring in such kids, put it at scale. They can even say, to go to our school, you have to do that plus add an extra 1,000 shekels a month, so they can provide even better experience that they would want if they want any kind of special school. If your kid is musically gifted, there will be a music creative school. And there's enough students to do that. If you're athletic, you can go there. If you're a genius in engineering and technology and computers, there will be schools and curriculum made for that, instead of them trying to force you into teachers and schools that is made to basically kind of cover for everybody. And this way, who's being funded? The students are being funded, their education is being funded with the teacher, with your parents, as opposed to unions and bureaucrats being funded and only giving pennies of the insane amount of money that goes to the education system. Actually makes it to your children's education that you have no say over what they're learning.
So, yeah, exactly. So it's important to understand that in the system today, the education system in Israel, because it's a government monopoly, the customers are the teachers, not the parents and the kids. The parents and the kids are the captive audience. They have to be there. They have to go to school. They have to go to a very specific school determined by the government. So the actual customers, clients, the people that the system works for are the teachers, especially the more senior teachers who get a fairly okay salary in Israeli standards. Another thing I would say is that in the ideal situation, just to kind of again demonstrate what I'm trying to offer, in the ideal situation, you don't even need an education bureau, education ministry. You don't need them. You replace them by a clerk in the Ministry of Finance with a small calculator that costs $5. He basically punches in the overall size of the education budget, divides it by the number of pupils, by the number of students in Israel. That comes to a number which is a voucher, and that voucher is being paid to any private school based on the number of pupils or kids that the school managed to convince to be, to join him. And just to give another example, which might sound a little bit odd or even vexing to some listeners, but I'm going to say it anyway. Think about how in Israel and many other countries you have advertisements or commercials for everything, for for dairy products, for shoes, for shirts, for cosmetics,
Cars, everything.
for cars, everything. But you almost never see advertisements for schools. You don't have schools advertising themselves. Why? Because they're all monopolies. They don't have to do anything other to exist. And the stream of poor pupils is going to flow into the school, get lousy education, and there's nothing you can do about that. The second you actually have those private schools within the voucher system, and those private schools have to compete with each other and convince parents to send them, their kids to that school, the school has to advertise itself. How do you do that? You say something, hey, I have this guy, he's a PhD in mathematics. He developed a new system to teach kids mathematics. It's well documented. He won prizes with, the way he kind of teaches mathematics. Send your kids to me and they're going to study mathematics in my school. And you're actually going to see that. If you have special schools that specialize in, I don't know, media or, I don't know, cinema or whatever, you're going to advertise the people that are, veterans of the industry that teach in your school. Finally, the clients or the kids are going to become the clients. Or more precisely, the parents, I guess, are going to become the clients rather than the teachers. And the final comment I'll make on that before you ask the next question is that, of course, the biggest beneficiaries of this new system are going to be parents and their kids. But also good teachers are going to be huge beneficiaries of the system.
Yes.
Because
good
how
teachers are underpaid.
Exactly. And
everyone talks about
But the secret weapon, the secret weapon of the school that wants to convince parents to send his kids or their kids to that school, the secret weapons are the good teachers, right? The school is going to be proud of the teacher, of the good teachers, as an attraction for the kids and for the parents. And those good teachers are going to have to be paid high wages to work in the schools that are interested in their services, just like Samsung is paying top dollars to great engineers. Very similar. And one thing that people have to grasp, and maybe it's not obvious, is that education is a service, a product, just like any other product and service, which has costs, which has measurable outcomes. And once you understand that education is simply a service, then you understand that as long as you have a government monopoly, the service is going to be completely and always lousy. And the only way to improve it is not by pouring more money into a sick system. Rather, the only way to do it is to reform it, to introduce free competition, which is the voucher system.
So I want to say something about actually special education. I was thinking about this the other night, is that I have some friends that have kids with special ed, and special ed costs more money. naturally they need more teachers, more handholding, and I want to like people maybe to like imagine what free market in education would look like, right? So if let's say your kid is autistic, and let's say the and therefore let's say what will happen is you will assign, instead of the government giving you the same amount as non-autistic children, you might get 2x or even 3x associated with your child. And then so when you send your child, you have far more buying power. What this also means is that for those that have children that aren't autistic, such as mine, I want them to be around, and my wife used to volunteer with kids with special ed. It's important for me for them to be around and understand children with special needs. It's very important, I think, for the development of children. What you'll do is you'll have regular schools that would like these extra, let's say this 3x, I'm throwing numbers out there, right? But 3x per student to bring revenue into the school. And what you're able to do is you can find opportunities where kids with special education aren't isolated only special education schools, but they can be exposed to the same other students that aren't in special ed that they're going to be working with and involved with when they're adults. We want to expose both special ed and non-special ed students to each other. I think it's good for society, it's good for children, it's good for empathy, it's good for growth for all kids. And under the current model, we're segregating all kinds of students. We're segregating, by the way, we're segregating Haredim from religious and religious from secular, and it drives people insane. I have a friend who, in Pardes Chana, a very good friend of mine, and they're not religious, and he has no interest in sending his kids to religious school. But he doesn't like that the secular schools are kind of anti-religious, right? I'm a friend of his, I am religious, and he was like, he doesn't. So he sends them to a private school that's a mixed school, a Montessori school that I'm probably going to send my kids to this fall. And so you have this opportunity only because it's private that while I'm able to expose my kids to other people with other opinions, with other philosophies and other things that also strongly supports what me as parents provide for them. And what you're finding out is we're pulling the only place where we're actually coming together as a society is where there's less regulation, which is and there's the most freedom of movement, and that is in the private sector in employment. Is that I hire based on merit, and that's where most people can be exposed to people that have different opinions and different backgrounds. If you're someone that's very pro-diversity like me, what we need to do is tell the government stop to say I will feed this group and I will feed that group and I will pick winners and I will pick losers. But instead, if they get out of the way, all of us can come together. We can become more integrated, more free, and then we'll also become more not just more integrated, but also more independent from one another in the government, and therefore we'll all be better off.
Yeah, also don't forget, not only there's an economic incentive for schools to accept kids that carry with them double or triple the voucher, but also think about reputation risk for not doing that. Because
Right.
schools that, for example, are going to, for whatever reason, ban, special need kids or whatever, they're going to be shamed and probably also
Correct.
demonstrated against. And no one is going to be, want to send their kids to a
Right.
school that is
Right.
being perceived rightly,
Right.
probably, as a school being managed by, social reprobates or whatever you want to call it. So it's not only a question of money, it's also a question of reputation. It makes sense for private companies in a free competition situation to be nice to everyone.
Yeah, I totally feel that way. All right, so let's finish up. It's been an hour and a half. This flew. I give 30 other topics that'd be fun to discuss. So Gilad, how can people learn a little bit more about you're involved with the Freedom Party? Let's not talk politics, but let's talk politics-ish. What does it mean to kind of like found the party, and what's the purpose of running in a party that needs like an insane amount, 3.25% of the electorate, if your probability is little to none? Would you say the best is that it's a megaphone in a way to probably get the message of freedom across?
Yeah, so I'll say just a few words because I guess, again, just like you said, you don't want to focus on this topic too much, but the Freedom Party is a libertarian party. Basically, our platform is everything I said over the last hour and a half. And I think there's a real audience for that in Israel, large enough to actually get even 3.5 percentage, the 4 mandates, and possibly a lot more even into parliament. The problem is that you need a lot of money. And actually, you know what? As a let me just make another comment on that before I speak more about the party. It's tough for Libertarian Party to get a lot of donations. And the reason for that is that against what everyone believes, or most people believe, rich people actually hate capitalism. Big companies hate capitalism.
Correct.
Capitalism is the biggest enemy of big companies.
It's their biggest
It's
threat.
the threat. Why is a big company a big company? Because they have a lot of market share. What is the number one risk over market share? Competition. What is capitalism? Competition. So big companies absolutely dread capitalism. Small companies love capitalism, but they don't have enough money to donate. The people that actually have enough money to donate in a way that actually makes a dent are the ones that actually object libertarian parties. Putting that aside, the reason for running and as a libertarian party, even if your chances of getting into parliament, especially as long as you don't have a big enough budget, are very, very small, is that someone needs to raise the standard. Someone needs to be the speaker for unbridled capitalism. Someone needs to speak about the voucher system, which no other party speaks about. And education, arguably, is the single most important factor for the long-term prosperity of the state of Israel. No one speaks about the voucher system. The only stuff politicians say is let's steal some more taxpayers' money and pull some more taxpayers' money into this sick system. We're the only ones who speak about the voucher system. We're the only ones who speak about turning Israel into a free market area. We're the only ones that speak about turning Israel into one of the least regulated economies in the world. So I think there's a lot of, I hope, there's a lot of value in saying stuff that no one else says, especially because all of that's, everything that we say is actually true, which is, I guess, an important part of the equation. So yeah, and beside the point of it being, I think, having value, and besides that, at some point maybe we will get enough budget to actually make a dent and go into parliament. Another thing is that I simply enjoy it.
Gilad, how much are you talking?
$1.3 million.
That's not that much.
Well, it's not that much, but
I mean, it's doable.
It's more,
you made it sound like
look,
it was
it's
impossible,
doable.
right?
It's doable, but you still need to raise the money, and history shows that even when you want,
what does it go? What would it go to? A party that has never been in parliament, that has very little following, right? What does it go to? What is it? Is it just infrastructure? Is it mostly marketing and advertising, or
marketing and advertising? Everything is marketing and advertising.
You don't tell me. I have a marketing advisor.
Yeah, exactly. Billboards are a huge issue. I mean, in my experience, at least, my limited experience in politics, the very specific time point when Zehut started to be perceived as a serious party back in 2019 were the billboards in Ayalon.
You know why?
Right? So why?
Because it's not a Zehut thing. It's the psychology of billboard marketing. When you take out ads, not on your either, it needs to be there. There's different ways to consume ads. You can consume advertising. Now, this is me. This is my expertise, advertising, right? You can consume advertising as an individual. I'm scrolling through my phone. Look at me. I see an ad on Facebook, on Google, on a website. No one knows I consumed it. I'm reading a magazine. I flip through. I see an ad or the newspaper. No one necessarily knows I consumed it. When it's on a billboard on the Ayalon outside of my office, I know I saw it, and I know every single person that walked in and out of my business in the last 30 days have seen it, and the tower next door, and the residential next door, and everyone sitting in traffic, I know has shared that experience. I can say, did you see that billboard? Yeah, I never heard of that party. What are they for? And that's the networking effect of marketing, is understanding how do you go viral. And there's a viral logistic, which is hard because we're all independent, right, in the advertising and the marketing sense. But then there's the marketing, the psychology, and the consumptions of us actually consuming media and marketing together, right? Like the old school, we'd sit around the TV as a family, right? Or now we would drive together in traffic and see the billboard, or listen to the radio together on the bus. So it was a communal thing, and it creates a little bit of a tipping point into a way that can gain steam, that it's now part of the public conversation because I know everyone around me has also consumed this new messaging that I have been that I've consumed.
So I guess that my intuition that the billboards played a major role in the political campaign of Zoot was possibly correct. But yes, so going back to your question, the money will go on billboards, promotion in social media, and that's the lion's share. SMS, sending messages, whatever. That's maybe less important. But surely billboards and promoting posts in social media are going to take 90% of that. And as long as you spend enough money on those things, and as long as your ideology sounds attractive and interesting, which I think in our cases it does, then you actually have a real chance of getting into parliament. And because of the structure of Israeli politics, a small party, as long as it's very ideologically coherent and knows exactly what it wants to achieve and is completely beholden only to its electorate, then the chances of actually making a real impact are high.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So the election is November 1st. If people want to vote for the Freedom Party or if they want to donate, how do they do that? Or we'll learn more, probably most importantly.
Yeah, you will learn more around September 15th is when we get the, when you basically need to register for the elections, you get your special letter and donations and whatever. So stay tuned.
If they want to learn more now, so where's the best place to follow?
Just go to our website, freeisrael.org.il.
Awesome. Gilad Alper, economist and founder of the Freedom Party in Israel. Thank you so much for everything you're doing, and thank you for being a guest. It was great speaking to you, my friend.
Thank you very much for this conversation.